right. Thank you all for coming. Good to see everybody. I hope you've had a chance to see the special exhibits in the fair. They're back towards the concession stands. Now I shall, excuse me, and now welcome our moderator. She's a Los Angeles Times writer, columnist, and podcaster who has a share of 2 Pulitzer Prizes. She's covered stories from presidential campaigns to the Super Bowl and the death of Princess Diana. For hosting her own public television and radio programs, she's won 6 Emmys and a dozen Golden Mike Awards. She appears regularly on the LA Times Today Spectrum news program. Her latest book, Don't Stop the Presses, Truth, Justice, and the American Newspaper, is a bestseller, as was her seminal nonfiction book, Rio, LA, Tales from the Los Angeles River, about the city's phantom waterway. Her most cherished accolade, though, is the legendary Hollywood hot dog stand Pink's has named a vegetarian hot dog the Patt Morrison Baja Veggie Dog in her honor. Please welcome Patt Morrison.
Thank you. And just so everybody knows, if you're looking for the Marie Kondo seminar, this is definitely the wrong room. We don't clear out anything. So I was looking into who collected books, and of course it goes way back to before printed books. Frederick Douglass had 2,000 books. Oprah has 1,500 books, but they were all free. Darwin had 1,480 books. Thomas Jefferson about 6,500 books. Harry Houdini had 5,000 books, but I don't think you could see any of them, actually. George Lucas has 27,000 books, but the winner, I wouldn't have guessed it, you wouldn't have guessed it, Karl Lagerfeld, a library of 300,000 books in 3 languages, so many that he stored them horizontally. So you didn't have to go like this to read the titles. I guess that's important when you're on the catwalk. So our authors today, our collectors today, can give you some insights into their collections, their philosophy of collecting, and we will have time at the end for your confessions about your collections and some questions too. I'm sure you'll have them. So let me introduce them briefly, and then you'll hear from them before we start in earnest in the panel. LA native Jim Tranquada, my old newspaper colleague and competitor, is the Director of Communications has been at UCLA and at Occidental College. He's the co-author with the late John King of The Ukulele, A History. It could be called a family business. His great-grandfather, Augusto Diaz, was one of the 3 original ukulele makers in Honolulu. I'm not going to do ukulele. It's so hard to make the transition. It's like musical code switching, kind of. We're not in Hawaii. So okay, all right, but I can do Hawaii. So he'll be talking about ukulele literature and collecting it. Secondly, we're going to hear from Randall Tarpey-Schwed, who's a collector of books and other materials. His expertise on America's greatest food writer, MFK Fisher. He's also knowledgeable about Helen Brown, the bibliophile and champion of West Coast cuisine. We'll hear a lot about that and some of the challenges of collecting overall from our panelists. Next up will be Whitney Milam, who is the California Young Book Collectors Prize winner for 2023 with dueling public narratives of Byron and Shelley. She's collected and written about and studied the lives of both of these romantic poets, a writer and a communications professional, and a member of the Byron Society and the Keats-Shelley Association of America. Coming up after that, excuse me while I'm shuffling a little bit here, we will have, we have Kitty Maryatt, who's the former director of the Scripps College Press and assistant professor of art at Scripps College in Claremont, who taught typography and the book arts for 30 years. She has a program of collaborative book editions created for each semester by the students, printed by letterpress, hand-bound by the students, and she doesn't like to use the word definition about books, but we'll figure out how she navigates her way through that. And her work is called, at present, Pushing the Envelope, Southern California Women Bookmakers. And Helena de Lemos is a special collections instruction and research librarian at Occidental College, where she set up the presence of the special collections in courses across the curriculum. This is the 3rd exhibit she's designed for the book fair here in Pasadena. Her previous one, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. showcase books from the Ned Gaiman collection of mystery and detective fiction. The Games Afoot, collecting Sherlock Holmes, is also part of her portfolio at Occidental College. I know we have some Sherlock Holmes fans here. I'm certainly among them. As a couple of you know, I've tried to get myself hypnotized so I will forget all the endings of the Holmes stories so I can read them again. I'm not a good subject for hypnosis, So anyway, so let us hear from our panels about their work, and then we'll plunge into our general conversation, and then, of course, with your questions. So let's start first with Jim Tranquada.
Thank you, Pat. My collection on ukulele literature, and you can consider that an oxymoron if you like, started about 25 years ago when I tried to determine whether or not the family stories about my great-great-grandfather were true. Turns out they were. He was one of the first 3 original ukulele makers in Hawaii. In the ukulele community, most people collect the instrument rather than books and ephemera, but I was approaching this more from the historian's perspective. There was no ukulele bibliography. There still isn't, at least not yet anyway. And there wasn't a whole lot written on the subject. So I took an omnivorous approach and read anything that potentially could bear on the subject that I could get my hands on. A lot of the material that I'm interested in is not particularly rare or valuable because there's not much demand for it. It's not particularly easy to find. So as Michael Sadlier observed of his now famous search for 19th century Gothic fiction, the genuinely difficult ones were those no one had bothered to want. And that has certainly been the case for me. But I really think that's the most fun kind of collecting, is collecting without a map, without a bibliography, with no guide to guide you.
Thank you, Jim. Next up, we have Randall Tarpey-Schwed and his delicious choice of subjects.
Thanks, Pat. My interest in book collecting largely centers around the history and culture of food and dining in California. And Pasadena has been the home to 2 great women culinary innovators. The first, Julia Child, is a household name. But the second, the little-known Helen Evans Brown, is also important. In California, we take for granted certain philosophies that inform the way we eat. We use our abundant agricultural resources that are available year-round. We accept culinary influences from around the globe. We give ourselves the flexibility to use ingredients and techniques in novel ways, if we wish to. And we take a more casual approach to dining, including outdoor dining. But those ideas didn't spring forth organically. They needed a thinker, a philosopher, if you will, and a promoter to package those ideas and to call them West Coast cuisine, or as we often call it today, California cuisine. So Helen Evans Brown was that person, and my exhibit tells her story.
Thank you. Whitney Milam.
Thanks, Pat. It's an honor to share the stage with these distinguished collectors. My own starter collection revolves around the lives and the afterlives of the Romantic poets, Percy Bysshe Shelley and Lord Byron. I've collected the most important and also the most controversial books that were published about them in the wake of their early deaths, most of which were memoirs by surviving friends and family members, kind of battling over control of their personas. And there's a lot of overlap and crossover because Byron and Shelley, of course, were friends and creative collaborators and fellow exiles, and they knew so many of the same people, especially toward the end of their lives. So what I realized as I was, putting each of these texts into context and studying the intertextuality between them is that Shelley and Byron, Shelley after death and Byron in both life and death, were really the prototypes for our modern conversations around celebrity. Everyone wanted to read their private letters. Their friends were writing tell-all books about them. Famous authors like Mark Twain and Harriet Beecher Stowe were basically inventing cancel culture by, exposing their relationship scandals and publishing impassioned defenses of their mistreated wives, and their families were struggling for control over the public narrative. So I've titled the collection, Dueling Public Narratives of Byron and Shelley.
So this would have been the tabloid of their time then.
Exactly.
Okay, now you got everybody really perked up on that. So, and Kitty Maryatt, you kind of created the genre that you're also collecting. You created and directing it.
Artists in any genre are always pushing the envelope, blurring former boundaries, and the relatively new genre of book art exhibits the same impulse. The exhibit I was invited to curate showcases Southern California women bookmakers innovating, either blatantly or subtly, for the last 40 years. I selected books first from my friends in our letterpress printing group, Women of Letters, who have been meeting regularly since 1980. Though some have moved away, the 17 members included in this exhibit cut their teeth making books in Southern California. There are 5 other remarkable women in the exhibit. The fine press and artist books chosen for the exhibition explore the following aspects of bookness. Number 1, construction. Catherine Ing built with Legos. I sewed a 2-foot-thick book. 2, text image treatment. Susan King generated her Haiti Kyle flag book. 3, layout and inventive use of language. Johanna Drucker wrote stochastic poetry. 4, extensive development of a previously known technique. Li Jiang scratched imagery into the negative film for printing plates. 5, a personal breakthrough in artistic practice. Robin Price moved away from what she called the corset of letterpress. You can also view a facsimile of a fabulous 1913 book by Sonia Delaunay and Blaise Sandrard, one of the progenitors of book art.
Wow. All of it sounds so exciting. I can see where I'm going to spend the next couple of days just roaming around and bothering all of you. Helena de Lemos, and Sherlock Holmes was my first celebrity crush, so be nice.
So I'll be here representing Mr. Ned Gaiman, who was the collector. He was born in 1900 and graduated from Occidental College in 1922. Soon after graduation, he decided to become a book collector by being inspired after reading about what fun collecting could be. And it was his love from his youth for Sherlock Holmes that made him decide to go that route. He first thought, first editions of American literature, but realized pretty quickly that was way too broad and a lot of people are competing in that field. So he went for Sherlock Holmes and also Edgar Allan Poe. And from there, he started collecting what became one of the largest collections in the world and on mystery and detective fiction. So he went very broad, very thorough, covering 4 centuries of materials, collected up until 1965, about then. And part of the collection focuses on Sherlock Holmes, because again, his first love. And so on the exhibit, we have the beginning of the Sherlock Holmes publications. We have the fandom phenomenon, because that's really like the first, what we regard now as fan fiction, and all this really starts there with Sherlock Holmes. When he killed Sherlock Holmes, 20,000 subscribers canceled their subscription to the Strand magazine in protest and sent terrible letters to him. And eventually, of course, he brought Holmes back. So the exhibit tries to focus on this impact that Sherlock Holmes had on pop culture.
It's just like soap operas where you think the character is dead and then there they are again. So some screenwriter obviously was responding to audience demand. So, but as you said, as all of you have alluded to, there's so many millions of books and hundreds of thousands of authors. So each of you give me an instant, like your road to Damascus moment when you found this is what you wanted and you knew you could plunge into this headlong and that this would be your dedication, not to say obsession. Randall?
Okay, well, 1992 in San Diego, I walked into a used bookstore and I saw a copy of M.F.K. Fisher's The Art of Eating. It was a paperback reprint, and I picked it up because I liked food, I liked eating, and I thought it might be an interesting read. And once I got into it, I discovered a writer who wrote like no other writer I'd ever experienced. And so she really is, for me, a literary figure and an important literary figure. As I got into that, though, I learned that she influenced many, many, many people in the broader food world. And so that's really how I became interested in books about food and wine and the culture of food and wine.
Did you have anybody saying, you're crazy to do this?
No, fortunately. I've had a lot of supporters, but maybe they talk about me behind my back.
Jim, we know you've got the family connection. Was that something your family talked a lot about, or did you decide to sort of resurrect this on your own?
Well, there was a book sitting on my grandparents' coffee table. It was a Chicago publisher's attempt to capitalize on the interest in Hawaii after statehood in 1959, and it was essentially just a cheap reprint of a lot of Encyclopedia Britannica article and some Paradise of the Pacific articles, which is now Honolulu Magazine, one of which was written by my auntie, Elma, about her grandfather, Augusto Diaz, and his role in introducing the ukulele to Hawaii. So it was that, I guess you could say it was that book that inspired me to look into this. And when it quickly became apparent that what had been written about the ukulele, with a few exceptions, was a repetition of the same stories over and over again without any indication as to where those stories actually came from or whether they were true or not, that's what got me started on trying to figure out what actually happened.
That was the journalist in you.
And the
running
history
it.
major, yes, yes. John's in my book is the only ukulele book that I know of with footnotes.
And can you show us the one that you brought? You were very nice to bring it, and I appreciate it. And there's no Pete Townsend stuff here. This will go away intact as it is coming into the room. So,
This is a replica of one of my great-great-grandfather's original ukuleles. This is from about 1885, 1886. It doesn't look like a conventional ukulele because it reflects its Madeiran roots. It's a lot longer and narrower, and it's koa back and sides, which is the native hardwood, the acacia, that's only occurs in Hawaii. But the soundboard is made out of fir, which reflects a more European sensibility. Hawaiians.
yeah, so many pine trees in Hawaii, right?
Actually, there was a lot of cheap lumber in Honolulu at the time. But eventually, all the makers made all koa instruments because koa is not only native, but it is long been associated with the royal family. And in the 1880s, there was a lot of political turmoil in Hawaii that ended up with the overthrow of the monarchy, the illegal overthrow of the monarchy, and ultimately annexation to the United States. And because koa was associated with the royal family, it was a royalist symbol of aloha aina, love of the land. So you were making a political statement if you had an all-koa ukulele.
Does the word really mean like leaping flea, as I have heard?
It does. It means jumping flea, and nobody knows exactly what prompted that. There are a bunch of different stories about why it was named jumping flea or leaping flea, and who knows which one, if any of them have any basis in reality.
I'm sure we'll see your footnotes.
Yes, there is one that deals with that.
Whitney, when you think of Byron and Shelley, it's like, okay, you read them in high school, the boys are embarrassed, and then you move on to Hemingway, and that's much better for them. So why did these guys catch your attention, especially since they are so well known? And did you think, can I find out anything new?
Sure. Well, I will say I personally never moved on to Hemingway. I stuck to the Romantics. I probably predictably was an English major. So I truly fell in love not only with their work, but also with their stories when I was introduced to them. They're just endlessly fascinating. And I mean, it's immediately clear reading not just their work, but also their letters and these memoirs, why there's been so much debate and devotion inspired by them for 200 years now, and really still is. So I am constantly finding new things to discover about the Romantics as I read absolutely everything I can about them. I've spent a little over a decade out of college now, so spent 10 years still reading about them.
So your epiphany was in college?
That's right. I was, as I said, an English major, and my focus was on the Romantics in college.
Was there one poem in particular that left you on your road to Damascus moment?
Ooh, I cannot pick a single poem, but I mean, I was especially fascinated by the relationship between Byron and Shelley and Julian and Medallo, for instance, which is the poem that Shelley wrote about him and Byron in Venice, and their conversation together, and how their works are not, related to each other and in conversation with each other, in addition to the two as individual poets.
Are they really like the original punks?
That's right. No, they were absolutely revolutionaries for their time, and they suffered for their beliefs. They were, as I said, both exiled from England, self-exiled, and incredibly controversial in their own time. And they were principled and passionate about those principles, and I have always really admired that. They lived up to their words.
And Kitty, you've sort of stepped back from the sense of, books are imminent everywhere. You find them in little libraries in people's neighborhoods. You can go into the Salvation Army and buy them by the armload. But your interest has now encompassed the sense of bookness, which is a word I love.
Well, I grew up in South Pasadena, and in 9th grade, all of the kids in junior high, 9th grade, made their autobiography. They had to write it, fold the paper down, handwrite it on the folded paper, sew the papers together, and bind it in wallpaper and vinyl. I didn't know that that was going to be my life's work, because my other 9th grade math teacher said that I should be a math teacher. So I said, okay. And so I did my career in math, and I got my master's in math. Once I did that, I found that I could take a calligraphy class, and then I found a bookbinding class, and I remembered, oh, in 9th grade, I loved that. In fact, I did 2 volumes instead of 1. And then I got into printing, because printing was so much easier than calligraphy. And then I finally realized that I would never get any better unless I quit my job teaching math. And I went back to school and got my MFA in bookmaking and started teaching at Scripps, and was there for 30 years. So, it took over my life because, of course, books are lovable. And what's so fun about them, too, is if you have a chance to make them yourself. So my mantra is every person should make one book in their life, and it could be blank. You should be able to know that you can sew a book. It's not glued.
Nice. Helena, your origin story, I suppose.
Well, since I'm here representing a collection that I did not put together, right? But I've been very fascinated by this collection all the time that I have worked at Occidental College. So my approach is, as I got to understand more of the collection, I saw that it really illustrates the development of a genre. So I found that fascinating, regardless whatever genre it is, that this collector really is told a story, which I think is what collections are, right? Of course, there's going to be holes, there might be biases in those stories, but they are telling a story. And when I realized the depth that Gaiman was telling that story, I'm still very impressed. He was doing at a time when he was, in an interview I read him saying, I had 10 years to myself. Nobody was paying attention to this stuff. So I was buying all these materials extremely cheaply. And unlike Jim Tranquada, there was no bibliography for the field. So there was no guide to tell him what were the important works in the 1700s and the 1800s. So he was writing to authors and asking them, so who influenced you? What do you recommend? He was carving his own way to figure out what he needed to get. And so the thoroughness of it, again, fascinating. How he goes into Gothic fiction, he goes into before the birth of the detective genre. He goes into true crime accounts from the 1600s even. And then he goes through in the 20th century. He's around the same time as hard-boiled fiction was happening, and some people are beginning to actually say, oh, this might be a literary, it might actually have some literary value, Raymond Chandler and Hammett. And he's around at that same time, so he's actually just buying the books as they're coming out and having the authors sign them. So now we go, oh, there's a first edition of Chandler signed. But yeah, I mean, he was just here in Los Angeles. So he had a vision to imagine that one day this stuff would be of interest.
So by collecting, you can almost create or acknowledge a genre that
Yes.
might not exist before, like that one, or like Jim's, with the ukulele. So everybody's got a holy grail, the thing that they're after. So I'd like to know, what is the most astonishing thing you found and what you're still looking for? And there may be something in the Gaiman collection for you, Helena, that is that astonishment. But he would have acknowledged that there were gaps, I'm sure, even in his own collection as he created it.
Well, I think that the first edition of Frankenstein is pretty astonishing to have, and first edition of Dracula and the Vampire. So that he has that trio and picture Dorian Gray. It's just so many moments, again, that still reverberate, especially in pop culture, that a lot of people are not even aware of, where these icons come from and why we're still talking about them. And they're all there.
And I remember holding a first edition of Pride and Prejudice. I think this was before she even put her name on it. And you just, the object itself became like a time machine, because you began to think, who else touched this? Who else held this? Who else read this? And I wonder if any of you have had that same response, not just to the content of the book, but the object of the book itself and how transporting it is. Don't all jump in at once. Randall.
I'll jump in. So MFK Fisher wrote a book in 1937 with the man who would become her husband, Dilwyn Parrish. They wrote the book under the pseudonym Victoria Bairn, and that's because they were living in Vevey near Bern, and Dilwyn Parrish had been admitted to the Victoria Hospital in Bern. Unfortunately, he was having his leg amputated at the time. So they wrote this novel, which was not successful at all, and it's very rare, almost impossible to find anywhere. And in fact, there are only a handful of libraries that have it. The copy that I found was inscribed by both Dilwyn Parrish and MFK Fisher, and it was inscribed to MFK Fisher's brother, David. And there's a sad element to this story because Dilwyn Parrish killed himself because he was suffering from Berger's disease and couldn't get the pain medication he needed to alleviate his suffering. And about a year later, before he was to go into the army, Fisher's brother, David, also killed himself. So there's the object, which is rare of itself, but the stories in that particular copy of the object are quite compelling.
Wow.
So that's my example.
And where did you find that?
On an e-commerce site, which should remain unnamed.
I'll go next.
So please, Kitty.
So in 1987, in Fine Print magazine, there was a fold-out of La Prose du Transsibérien by Sonia Delaunay and Blaise Sandrard, and it knocked me out. I just couldn't believe that this was a book because it was 6.5 feet long by 14 inches wide. How could that be a book? So I had to go up to the Getty Museum and see it, and I was knocked out further because it was a stenciled book, letterpress printed and stenciled, and I had never seen stencils like that. And I wanted one, but it was $500,000. So I decided to make one. And I was trying to figure out the pochoir myself, and went to France to learn pochoir from the French people who were still doing it commercially. And eventually I thought that they should be the ones to make a new facsimile of it with the original techniques. And I ended up doing an edition. So that is the book that I've been working with since 1987.
Wow. Whitney, did you have a great find and still a great grail out there?
I mean, someday a first edition of Frankenstein will be in my ability to buy. That would certainly be a holy grail. But no, I'm, as I said, starting my collection, and I have always just, I don't know, found something really special, magical even, about the sensory element of holding something, touching something that people were holding and touching hundreds of years ago, and being able to preserve it so people hundreds of years from now can hopefully do the same. There's something really special about that, and especially in the age of digitization, excuse me, it's I don't know, there's a real reverence that I feel for the book as a physical object, so I'm always finding it special.
And Jim, because you have a personal family collection too, and are looking into an area that most people don't even recognize as a genre or a subgenre, maybe you have an advantage and maybe you have a disadvantage.
It necessarily, collecting ukulele literature necessarily means ephemera. And looking at contemporary newspapers and magazines, and I'll never forget, I was leafing, well, not leafing, it was digitized copy of Uluju, which was one of the Portuguese language newspapers published in Honolulu. And there was a story about my great-great-grandfather, about a disgraceful row that broke out, and he got in an argument with somebody and shoved him through a window. My great-grandfather was short and had a short man's temper, I think. But what I found particularly fascinating about this particular story was it gave his name, but it also referred to him by his nickname, which was Usantinho. And I had heard that through the family, but it was wonderful to find out that the family story about his nickname, which means the little saint, because he wasn't, was true. I thought that was, it was a little flash of recognition that helped bring him alive, even though it was a disgraceful affair.
Did you all have to acquire a certain skill? Like obviously Jim had to read Portuguese in order to do this. For all of you, was there something that you had to learn or acquire in order to know what you were doing to enhance your ability to collect your knowledge? Randall, did you have to taste everything that MFK Fisher ever ate? I mean, it's a hardship, but.
Yeah, it's a really good question, Pat, and I think it gets to sort of advice for people. I hate giving advice, but advice for people who are wanting to collect. And I think you just need to read as much as you can about your subject, and read about things that might be peripheral to your subject. And then you kind of make discoveries along the way about your subject. And then when you see an object, something will click and you'll say, oh, this is important because A knew B, who knew C, or was there at a particular time.
So it's context to your subject as well, like the matrix for it.
Absolutely.
Huh. But yeah, I would think that for all of you, there was something like that. What was going on in the larger world? What was the nature of communications when letters were being exchanged and things like that? What is you mentioned e-commerce, what has the internet done to collecting? Because I don't think there's anything like that magical sense of serendipity where you're rummaging through, old bins and files and shelves and something takes your breath away and you think, I feel like Indiana Jones, I found this thing. And nowadays it seems like so much is online for whatever price you're able to pay that does it take some of the thrill out of it, or does it make you think, finally now I can get that thing I've been looking for?
Can I say something about that?
Sure.
Book art is kind of harder to collect because they're not in antiquarian book fairs normally, and or even in kind of normal book fairs. You have to go to specialty artist books fairs. But the internet has helped a lot, that the artists who make the books often have a website, and you can go to their website and buy books directly from the artist. You don't necessarily need a dealer to go to. There are a few dealers, even here, that I could mention. For example, Michael Thompson Books has wonderful book art and fine press books. And if you want some pochoir, that's even harder to find. You can go to Leonard Fox, for example. But the fact that artists often try to sell their own books and can't afford even to have a dealer take their percentage off the top makes it harder to collect book art. But there are exhibits from time to time that you could pay attention to at universities and museums sometimes. And sometimes, you know, the really big deal books get a lot of airplay, and even where you wouldn't even think that books would be happening by this particular artist, but somebody like Anselm Kiefer, for example, made a lot of really wild and wonderful books, huge installation type books. So again, blurring the boundaries.
Whitney, did you? Oh, Jim, go ahead. You were going for the mic.
Well, I agree with you, Pat. I would much rather patronize a wonderful establishment like Acres of Books in the late lamented Acres of Books in Long Beach, where there's acres of books and you never know what you're going to find.
Bertram Smith, right?
But there's a famous saying in book collecting that it's not just that the early bird gets the worm, but he or she recognizes the worm when he or she sees it. And the same is true online as it is in a dusty bookstore. And I've found, you know, on eBay is a classic ukulele collecting site, because people throw all kinds of stuff out there and they don't necessarily know what it is. And I could get really excited about something that I see on eBay that I will just buy outright. I'm not going to bother with the bidding stuff because it's a tremendous bargain from my perspective anyway.
And if people misspell ukulele, so much the better, right?
Well, when you're a ukulele collector, it's not only the misspelling of ukulele, but going back to what Randy was talking about, knowledge, you're not going to find any of the earliest material under the name ukulele. You have to look for taro patch fiddle, which is what the most broadly used term, and then Portuguese fiddle, and there's a bunch of different variations. You have to search for all of those in order to find really what you're looking for.
Kind of the context that Randall was talking about. So, Whitney, what about you?
I mean, I would say, from my perspective, I agree that nothing will beat the magic of stumbling across the perfect book in a used bookstore. But I do think it's important to acknowledge that the internet has really made book collecting so much more accessible to a wider range of collectors, especially young collectors who now have access to a wide range of books at a variety of price points all over the world, and are able to, you know, research and compare and learn about the market in ways that they wouldn't otherwise be able to. So I think that that's a perspective that I would bring to that conversation as well.
And hang on a second, Randall. Helena, collecting for an institution, though, must be different. I mean, the budget considerations are different. The idea of what you need versus what you want must be different.
Yeah, certainly. We have to take several things into consideration, how it's going to be used, if you're going to use for classes, if it's going to, where it's going to fit in the curriculum, what usage we're going to get out of it, not just, you know, prestige. It has to mean something for the students. So yes, the internet definitely helps. We can see, we can compare prices, and we can see who has what. We can be very specific. We're missing items in this kind of area, for example. We need to fill certain holes in our collections, and then we can have this much more targeted searches. So yeah, it definitely has helped a lot. But then, of course, it's great fun coming to the book fair and then finding things that we didn't maybe expect that we're looking for, but then, oh, here it is, and maybe the price is good, and we don't have to pay for shipping, and, you know, so, yes, so I think, yeah, we make both systems work.
And Randall, you were going to?
Yeah, I'll just quickly add that I think that the internet has made it easier to buy to find certain kinds of materials, and Jim mentioned ephemeral materials as well. You know, my Fisher collection includes about 200 original appearances of Fisher's writing in magazines and periodicals, and you know, because those things oftentimes sell for $10 or $15, you know, booksellers can't afford to stock a lot of $10 and $15 items. So, our knowledge of a topic is more accessible, I think, when we use e-commerce along with dealer resources.
Each of you gave me a couple of questions you wanted to get to, and all of you had the same question, although couched differently, which is, why is collecting worthwhile? What can people gain by collecting? Because there are probably people out here who have questions for you, which we'll get to in a moment. But your sense of gratification or contributing to, the larger sense of knowledge that will someday, this collection will someday be in hands that will be eager to access what you have been able to accumulate. So just riff on that for a minute, if you would. Kitty, would you start?
I have a very small personal collection, so it's kind of hard to answer that question because I'm not a big deal, $500,000 collector to get a La Prose. So the reason that I started collecting was that I would collect books that I couldn't make, or that I admired the techniques or the visuality of a book, or the message that it had, those kinds of books that I would want in my collection that would be quite unique, something that I just couldn't do myself, because I like making books myself too.
Whitney?
Yeah, I mean, I'm very passionate about the preservation of knowledge and the democratization of knowledge. Book collecting used to be such a rarefied pursuit that was only really doable for the wealthiest and the most privileged. And now it's more accessible than it has been in the history of the written word. So I'm taking full advantage of that. And as a lover of history, these are historical artifacts. And these are objects of history themselves. So
Do you sit and look at them
I absolutely do.
and admire them and rub your hands together and think, yes, more yet to come?
That is not an exaggeration. I do that.
Helena? Because
So-
I mean, people must, and for all of you, some people must say, oh, you're collecting books or items on fill in the blank, and think, this is a pretty strange person, as they edge slowly toward the door. Helena?
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you repeat?
Just the sense of what you can gain by collecting, and to
Yes.
what extent it may alienate people when you get a little bit manic about stuff.
I mean, I have two very small collections, so I wouldn't call myself a collector. But what I have observed since I've been in this world, since I've been in special collections, and now I belong to a club of bibliophiles. There have many collectors. It actually it's something beyond the books themselves or the materials that you're collecting. It's actually community. I think a lot of people then, once they become collectors, they start belonging to these clubs or societies. They get to meet like-minded people. So there's this whole, you get to meet people that maybe you otherwise wouldn't, from different professions, but you have this thing in common. Might not even be that same subject, but the fact that you're also a collector, and then you start going to these fairs, it just creates this parallel universe where there's a sense of belonging. I think that's what's very attractive as well.
It's like the college reunion you wish you had, right? Without some of the people you're happy not to see. So, and Jim and Randall?
Collecting ukulele material is unconventional. When I started collecting 25 years ago, in the United States, everyone's opinion of the ukulele was colored by Tiny Tim, just like it was colored by George Formby in the UK, which just tends to make people take it even less seriously. But my collection, the first book about the history of the ukulele wasn't published until 1980. And my partner John and I, we wrote the book that we wished we could have found because there wasn't one. So my collection was all about contributing to some form of knowledge because I had to gather this material myself because it didn't really exist in a collected form anywhere.
And but let me ask, the ukulele has come in and out of vogue. It isn't just Tiny Tim. I think in the 20s, the crooner period, there was some ukulele music, the Hawaiian vogue. I seem to remember sheet music too.
Well, the hidden history of the ukulele is, well, the history of the ukulele is mostly hidden. Crazy Rhythm by George Gershwin was introduced on Broadway by a guy playing the ukulele. And sheet music publishers in the 20s were saved because radio was stealing all of the sheet music sales, and they were saved by the publication of cheap ukulele methods and songbooks. Just like the Martin Guitar Company of Nazareth, Pennsylvania, which to guitar aficionados is very well known. They were selling just a couple hundred guitars a year when the ukulele became popular. That became their biggest selling item, and it essentially saved the Martin Guitar Company. So there's, there's lots of examples like that.
Just ask him. He's got it all. Randall?
Yeah, I'll just add that the commonality that I see among most collectors is that they're curious people. And curious people are interesting. So I agree with Elena's point that it's a wonderful community, the community of book collectors.
So let's start to take your questions. And I'm sure some of you would like some advice as you're starting collecting, or maybe your collection is coming along. We have microphones to bring to you, and we'll hold on to them as we do. So if you could stand up, it'll make it a little easier for me to see where you are. Do we have somebody back there? Okay. We'll hold on to the mic, thanks.
Hi, my name is Jack Pursley. I'm not much of a collector of anything of value. It's wonderful to see things here. But I'm interested particularly in maybe the gentleman with the ukulele collection, the food artist, and the bookmaker. There's something about a book compared to something electronic that holding it and hefting it is of value. And I've now started to have a dialogue with myself when I read a book and I write notes in it. And it's really enjoyable for me to do independently. I doubt my comments would be of any value to anybody but my descendants. But I'm wondering, when you think about recipes or ukulele books or your own books, do you think there's something about writing into the book and putting in your own comments and preserving it for people who might inherit your collection versus kind of the Beanie Baby that you keep wrapped in plastic and never becomes the Velveteen Rabbit?
Oh, excellent.
And so I'm interested in your thoughts about that, not for something that's clearly already of established value, but when you're doing it sort of for the joy, if it really enhances your joy, what advice would you give to someone? But you never know what might become extraordinarily valuable.
I love that question. It's so good, and I'm sure it's occurred to everybody here, because I love marginalia. I love finding it, and I love doing it. So talk about that value, the physical book, and then writing in a book that will go on to somebody else who will draw some conclusions of their own, disagree, have a dialogue with whoever had written the marginalia, who may be long gone. I just love that about books.
Can I say something about that? That there's a long history of people writing in books. A commentary on a difficult to understand tome, and typographically it looks so beautiful when somebody later on decides that those comments are very worthy and that they would print them in a smaller type and put them next to the original text. I think that sometimes it's irritating to get a book that is already written in because now you have to read the commentary. But for descendants, then it certainly tells about your personality and your interests. And when I would have my students make books, especially if they had to choose a text and do something in reaction to that text, those comments about the text are so important to have the voice, your own voice when you're making a book. So I think that you can look at commentary in a book in many different ways. Either you don't want it in there or it's valuable.
Jim?
This has nothing to do with ukulele, but in my own collection of non-ukulele stuff, some of the volumes I prize the most are ones that belong to my grandmother, who carried on a dialogue with the authors that she was reading. This was in like 1920, 1921, 1922, right after she graduated from college, and she was clearly struggling, trying to figure out what her role as a woman in modern society would be, and what marriage meant, and what children meant or would mean. And to me, it's just fascinating to see this dialogue from 100 years ago.
What a gift.
That my grandmother, who obviously I didn't know when she was in her 20s, it really brings her alive as a person.
Anybody else? Do we have another question? Can you stand up? We'll hold on to the microphone. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Yulene, and I was wondering, when I'm looking for advice for this moment in collection, when you encounter an object that you really love, and the price point might just be at that point where you're like, I'm not sure. So what do you ask yourself? What kind of informs your philosophy of, do I take the plunge and actually buy it, or do I just take a nice photo and think about it?
Yeah. Do I really need a 401k, right?
I'll take that one on. When I encounter that, I ask myself one question. If I don't buy this book and it's never available again, will I regret it for the rest of my life? And oftentimes the answer is no. So I can wait, I can think about it. But on those occasions when the answer is yes, just take the plunge. That's my advice. But it shouldn't apply to anyone else. That's how I resolve that conflict.
It applies to me too. This morning I saw a book that I already have, but it was an deluxe version, and it had a plate that I've been looking for that I only know exists in 3 places in the world. And I said, I have to have it. You know, I can't afford it. I already have one. But there's certain things you have to have, and I'll figure out where the other book that I already have will go.
Whitney? As starting as a student especially.
I'm also taking notes here. I would love to hear everyone's answers to those questions. My philosophy has always just been buy the best that you can afford at the time, which has increased as I go and will hopefully continue to increase.
The book budget, yes. Where does it come
Yeah.
in with rent and that sort of thing? Somebody else? We have another question? Yes, we do. We'll come to you. And
I'm going to come around.
no, we'll hold on to the mic. Thank you.
Here we go.
Hi, I'm Sue Robinson, a book artist, and I just wanted to make another small comparison. We all recognize that there are very expensive, understandably very expensive books. The interesting thing about artist books is that it's a way of collecting art that's less expensive than collecting painting or sculpture. Most artist books are not priced the same way that other art forms are priced. So that's something to keep in mind if you're collecting.
Kitty, I'm sure, has something to say about that. You're collecting 2 things at the same time, the book and the art.
Absolutely. And, when I first got my MFA in graphic design with an interest in bookmaking, I met a person and they asked me, what did I do? And I said, I'm a book artist. Well, I'm not really. I don't know what a book artist really is. Does that mean that I make art for a book and so on? So I was going to make a point about the expensiveness, I guess, of book art and collecting it. Regular books cover every single subject matter known to mankind, and so do artist books. And just some artist books focus more on making the physicality of the book or the sensibility of the book or all the parts of the book come together in such a way that it's more enhanced than a normal codex book that even has valuable poetry or whatever inside of it. So they're quite worthy to have as sort of more than a book. And that's why it's valuable to have them, I think.
We have another question? Oh, there's one up here, please. Thank you, Neil.
Hi, I collect some Art Deco ephemera, and you mentioned the term bourgeois, and I'm only guessing that some people in the audience don't know what that term means, and I don't really understand it. I have some. I believe that it's somewhat like a stenciling technique, but I wish you would explain it to us.
Yeah. Thank you. The word pochoir in French is stencil. Therefore, there are 10,000 different ways that you could do pochoir. So I call it traditional French pochoir. So if you have a French Art Deco, then it's probably done with gouache, possibly watercolor. It's done through a stencil, and it's with a beautiful brush that has no handle on it, and it swirls around. So that's the technique that I refer to when I say pochoir. But if anybody else says, I'm learning pochoir at the San Francisco Center for the Book, and I said, oh, what kind? You know, so it's just a generic term like Kleenex.
Thank you. And for all of you, people may not think that what they have is a collection or the beginning of a collection. But if they're interested and they've accumulated, what, more than a half dozen things? I mean, I over the course of my career, when I've interviewed people, I've asked them to sign the books that I've interviewed them about, and that turned into a collection without my actually realizing it. So I wonder if people kind of underestimate what a collection is and what their interest and acuities are. Somebody want to speak to that?
Let me say that there are a lot of book clubs out here, and they usually, when they invite you to join the book club, especially if it's one where you have to go meet the members, you know, and then they vote on you or something like that, they want to know what your collection is like. So when you have a very small collection, very modest, you know, you don't know exactly what to say. I have a collection of early manuscripts from the 14th century. You know, one page, you might have 5 of them or something like that. So, but as soon as you find that you have an interest and you have more than 5 of them, you're a collector.
Okay, so 5 is the number. Keep that in mind. Somebody else?
I think becoming a collector means not being just an accumulator, but that you are seeking out particular subject area, particular author, particular treatment of the book as object, because you could have thousands of books and not really be a collector, I think. You could have 5 and be a collector because you're just pick something where there isn't that much that's immediately available.
Yes, I would say intention. You're not just grabbing stuff, even though once you have enough stuff, you can actually even find a narrative for that stuff. But if there's, you know, intention on what this goes with this and then complements that, and then this one reflects on this, once you begin all those threads, then yeah, you have a collection.
Years ago, there was a bookshop on Western Avenue that was run by the man who said he was the only registered monarchist in LA County voter rolls. And when he died, his daughters sold off the books at $1 a piece. And so I know it's kind of ooh. And so I made 3 carload trips. You know, you take the books, you stop at the bank, you go back and you get some more books. And from that, as Helena said, I was able to discern interests that I hadn't even necessarily been aware of and say, oh, this is what I like. This is what I want to get more of. And perhaps you've all had that same experience, although not with your car dragging all the way down Western Avenue. Do we have another question? Yes.
Time for one last question.
Okay, can we hear your question,
Hi, it's
please?
Zach. Hi there. Very loud. So I've just started collecting books. They're all kind of books that I'm not able to find information about online, and that's where I've been going for a lot of research. I'm curious, as you're going through a collection of books, is there anything you're finding in the text that's just like, it's not written down anywhere else? Are you finding sort of like little bits or shibboleths of history that they've not made it at the 100 or plus years long? And are you using, like, I guess the question is, are there little things like that you found that, I guess a niche for you that you might share, something you found just in text that isn't something that's really part of popular culture right now?
Anybody, something surprising that's jumped out at you from what you've run across? It sounds like you found such a thing, yes?
A lot of my collecting deals with popular culture, of course, so that leads the tuning to the traditional tuning for a ukulele is generally known as "My Dog Has Fleas," GCEA. So where did that come from? Where does "My Dog Have Fleas" come from? I don't have an answer to that yet. And actually, one of the earliest clues I found was in the movie Honolulu with Gracie Fields in 1937, 38, where she's tuning up a ukulele and my dog has fleas. That's one of the earliest examples that I've found. But oftentimes in collecting, you end up asking questions you don't have answers to, and part of your collecting ends up being a pursuit of an answer to that particular question.
The thrill of the chase. Thank you, Sherlock Holmes. So, well, I want to thank all of you for being here. I'm hopeful that some of the panel will be able to stick around and answer some of your questions if you have them afterwards, and definitely go to see their exhibits and what's out there in the hall. So thank you all for coming, and thanks to our excellent panel.
Thank you.
And
Could I
thank you,
get this
Pat.
mic? Thanks, everybody, again. Let's hear it again for Patt Morrison.
Thanks, everybody.
And our panelists. And we do encourage that you continue conversations with the panelists. However, we do need to change the room over for our next speaker. So if we could have everybody move on out and carry the conversations out in the hall, or even better yet, back at the special collections exhibits would be fantastic. Thank you so much for coming.